Welcome to Colossians and Philemon. We're going to get started in Philemon. We're going to get started by looking at some of the doctrines in Philemon, such as the doctrine of slavery, and then the doctrine of reconciliation between Christians, and the doctrine of imputation. Modern slavery, or human trafficking as we refer to it, is not modern. It's as old as the Old Testament. Philemon is going to give us some good biblical attitudes that we can have when we're thinking about slavery or just difficult circumstances in life in which we may think we are enslaved. But there are more slaves today than any other time. Modern slavery is one of the fastest growing crimes in the United States, with North Carolina being the most affected states of the states. It's pretty incredible. Our school is in North Carolina, Winston-Salem. Here's some numbers from 2024. 268 cases of trafficking were reported to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, ranking North Carolina 11th among the 50 states in cases reported. And according to the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, there is now an average of 78 sex trafficking cases every year in North Carolina, and Charlotte is the number one city. I want to look at just a few clips here to illustrate modern slavery.
Human trafficking is the fastest growing crime industry in the world today. North Carolina has been ranked in the top 10 states for human trafficking in the USA. Charlotte is the number one location in North Carolina for sex trafficking. There are more slaves on the planet today than at any other time period in history. Many of those slaves are individuals who are trapped in the sex trade, some of which are enslaved right here on the streets in Charlotte, North Carolina. Did you know that today in the United States of America, the average age of entry into the sex trade for a young girl is 13 years old? At Justice Ministries, we are not okay with this.
Let's look at this next clip, which is an actual case of modern day abolitionists trying to save somebody from the sex trade.
Mark, where are we going?
Tonight we're headed towards a place we found it's pretty common to have girls walking the street.
It's street prostitution.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part it would be labeled as street prostitution. It's just our concern is that some of the girls are forced to walk the beat, against their will.
Mark and Amy are two activists who are attempting to assist an often hidden population, the victims of sex trafficking. The U.S. government defines sex trafficking as any commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion.
We're just trying to go out and maybe reach a few of these girls and hand out some of our cards to let them know that if you want to get out, we can provide a way out and just help you kind of get out of this lifestyle.
We arrive at the track, a term used to describe a city's street prostitution area.
Here's a girl right here to the left.
Among prostitutes, 75% are selling themselves because they are working for a pimp.
These guys kidnap, kill, and rape women for a living, so they're you need to know that going in. They're pretty dangerous people. There's a lady.
And then there's another one too there.
Did you want to have a car?
Yeah.
It's pretty tore up.
Amy spots one young girl who seems especially distraught.
Look at that. Oh, see that? I think she needs help. Come. Yeah. Sure.
The girl's erratic behavior could indicate that she is a trafficking victim.
Hey, I have a question. My name's Amy. If you ever need anything like clothing, food, anything, want to get out of the game? Okay. Yeah, I saw your right hand. Yeah. My name's Amy. We help girls get out of the game, all that kind of stuff, whatever they need. Okay. What's your name?
Katie.
Katie? Yeah. If you need anything, call me. It's 24/7.
Are you okay?
Not really.
Are you safe?
What happened?
Yeah.
What's up, babe?
A lot of
Yeah? How old are you?
23.
You're so young. You're a baby. Where are you from?
Philly.
Oh, okay. Where have you been staying? Just around.
Hotels.
Okay. Are you working the streets right now? A little bit. It's okay. I know it's scary. I know it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a guy coming up now. I think that's probably your pimp.
As the girl starts to cry, we have no idea that this man is eyeing us from just a few feet away.
We have to hop out.
Do you have a pen, or are you just doing it on your own?
No.
Okay.
My own, but I mean, people has tried to.
Totally.
I'll
Okay.
give you a call though because my boyfriend's across the street waiting.
But Katie, if you want to get out, call me. We can get you out. We can get you safe. Like if you're in danger, I can get you. There's a cop right there, so just be careful. So call me.
I will.
24/7. Okay.
Thank you.
24/7. 24/7. Okay. You're precious.
Thank you. I will call you.
Call me. Okay. Bye, baby.
So sorry.
I know, right?
So there's a modern example of what we're looking at in Scripture, looking at the subject of slavery. We're going to focus on Philemon eventually, but I want us to sort of widen out our look and try to look at what the Scriptures say about it. And we'll start in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 15:12-18. Every seventh year was a Sabbath year when slaves were freed. But someone asked the question, why did God allow slavery in the first place? So you have atheists like Richard Dawkins who love to bring up this issue. He does this in his book, Outgrowing God, when he says, not surprisingly, since the Bible's morality was of its time, slavery is not condemned there. He's saying basically the morality of the culture around Israel is reflected in Israel. That is totally untrue. Slavery outside of Israel was nothing compared to the way God addresses this institution ingrained in society. Slavery in the Old Testament was different from modern slavery or Civil War slavery. This man's name is Peter. He's called Peter. He's also Gordon, and Gordon was his name. 1863, he escaped from his slavery, his slave master. And here's just a picture of the abuse that he received when a slave. The Old Testament forbade this. But again, outside of the Bible, even in the Roman Empire, a wealthy woman had her slave crucified just for her own good pleasure. Juvenal, 2nd century Roman poet, wrote about this. You can read it if you want to look at his diatribe against women, the women of Rome. This kind of cruelty was not permitted in the Old Testament. Old Testament slaves were indentured servants or hired household employees who were paying off their debt. But slavery was prevalent among the nations. We know, Luke 21:24. Jesus predicted that the Romans would come, capture Israel in AD 70, and take them into slavery, kidnap them. Slavery through kidnapping was punishable by death in the Old Testament, according to Deuteronomy 24:7, and forbidden in the New Testament, according to Paul in 1 Timothy 1. Slaves could not be mistreated. I want to turn to this passage, Exodus 21. In Exodus 20, God gives the 10 Commandments. And beginning in Exodus 21, he starts giving case laws or examples of how these 10 Commandments could be executed in the nation of Israel. You have the commandment, thou shalt not kill. So verse 23, Exodus 21:23, and if any mischief follow, then shall you give life for life. That's capital punishment. But he breaks it down and he says, verse 27, and if he smite, that is the slave master, smite his servant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. In other words, mistreatment was forbidden. And if a slave was mistreated, that slave had his freedom. Runaway slaves could not be returned to their owners, according to Deuteronomy 23. It would be assumed if the slave ran away, then he was being mistreated, and the one who now had the slave did not have to return him. This is in contrast to the Hammurabi Code, the Babylonian legal text, which required death for runaway slaves. So Richard Dawkins is wrong. The Bible does not reflect the morality around the nation of Israel. God had his own set of rules. Slaves could volunteer to stay with their owner. A slave would only want to stay with his owner, let's say, instead of being freed after the debt was paid or in the sabbatical year, because that owner was good to him. The Old Testament law on slavery was to ultimately undermine slavery. You have different views among Christians on slavery. One view contends that Paul supported slavery because of the household codes that we looked at in Colossians 3, similar to Ephesians 6. One of those preachers was Thornton Stringfellow. You can click there to read his sermon where he justifies slavery by appealing to Paul. This was before the Emancipation Proclamation. This was his way of justifying slavery from Scripture, which was a false interpretation. But you had some very prominent preachers who owned slaves. The first Great Awakening preacher, George Whitefield, owned slaves and supported slavery. In colonial Georgia, which had banned slavery, Whitefield sought to overturn the ban because he wanted to fund his orphanage by raising up plantations and having slaves work on those plantations. He not only owned slaves, he overturned the ban on slavery. Here's a good article. This is by Thomas Kidd to help us when we find out these truths about one of the greatest evangelists ever, George Whitefield. The evangelist that Charles Spurgeon wanted to emulate. And then you had the other Great Awakening preacher with Jonathan Edwards, considered one of the greatest theologians of all time by some. And so Thomas Kidd deals with when our heroes don't live up to their theology. So that's a good article to read to help us deal with this. Different views among Christians on slavery. One is that Paul supported it because of the household codes. But in that same article by Thomas Kidd, he mentioned some other preachers who preached against slavery. They did not make the mistakes of Jonathan Edwards, who owned slaves, and George Whitefield, who owned slaves. One of those preachers was Lemuel Haynes, who was a former African-American Revolutionary War soldier, ordained pastor, and critic of American slavery. Preached against it in that sermon right there. And near the end of that sermon, he concluded by admonishing the slave-owning supporters of the revolutionary cause to contend. So who's he addressing? These slave owners who were fighting for freedom, independence in the Revolutionary War, independence from England because of the oppression of England on the colonies. But look what he says to them. Contend in a consistent manner in the quest for America's self-determination by aligning the patriotic zeal that fires your breast with a disposition to further expressions of so noble a spirit that would, to quote from Scripture, let the oppressed, that is slaves, go free. You're fighting for freedom in the colonies, but yet you hold people in slavery. And his point is, it's inconsistent, it's hypocritical. So you have the different views among Christians. Paul supported slavery, untrue. We'll see that in Philemon. And then Paul was more concerned about inner freedom. Let's go to this 1 Corinthians chapter 7 passage. Again, Paul is subtly dealing with the issue of slavery. He's not calling for protests. He's not calling on Christians to take up arms because he knew that would result in death. What he's doing here in these verses, 1 Corinthians 7, 20 to 24, he's saying basically bloom where you're planted. There's some things out of our control. And one of those circumstances would be slavery. But we have to remember that the slavery of the first century should not be compared with modern slavery or Civil War slavery. This is Gordon Fee in his commentary on 1 Corinthians saying that the slavery of the first century was much better than the slavery of such as the Civil War or even modern slavery or some of those exceptions even in the Roman society. The slaves, he writes, had considerable freedom and very often experienced mutual benefit from the slavery. Our textbook by Homer Kent said that sometimes a freedman would sell himself back into slavery because his life as a slave was much better. He had the security of employment and needs being met. Well, Paul is addressing these slaves in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 20, let every man abide with the same calling in the circumstance where he is. If God called you to salvation in slavery, then if you can have freedom, then yes, seek it. But if freedom is impossible, he's basically saying, be content. Verse 21, are you called, being a servant, a slave? Were you called to salvation as a slave? Don't be anxious about that. But if you may be free, then yes, be free. Verse 22, for he that is called in the Lord, being a slave, is the Lord's freeman. You have been freed from the slavery of sin. And likewise, he that is called being free is Christ's slave. Be content where you are. Yes, be the best you can be. Do your work not just for your human master, but for your master who is in heaven. He taught them in Colossians chapter 3. And if that results in freedom, that's accepted. But if it doesn't, if freedom is not imminent, then be content. Paul is just trying to help the slaves endure a circumstance that is not ideal. Most of us find ourselves in circumstances, even employment, sometimes that is not ideal. We should do our best to improve, get better, get a better job. but we have to be content until those circumstances change. I think that's what Paul is doing there. So here's the different views. The third one, first century slavery was benign. Paul praised Christian Philemon. That's because Philemon was a good master. But in Colossians 3, he warned those masters who were not good. So there were exceptions. And Paul addresses those exceptions in his letters. Verse 20, this is Colossians 3:25, but he that does wrong shall receive for the wrong which he has done, and there is no respect of persons. Chapter 4, verse 1, masters, give your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that your master is in heaven. So he's warning masters who would be abusive. So not all slavery was benign. And then we're going to see first century slavery was an evil institution of violence. That's what Paul knew, and he was trying to help the slave masters and slaves in that institution make the best of this situation. And then in subtle ways undermine slavery, as we're going to see with the way he dealt with Philemon, who Paul led to the Lord, and then in essence told him, free Onesimus. So Paul was indirectly attacking an institution that was ingrained in society. We'll look more into that next time.